So to change the culture, you have to change the behavior. To change the behavior, you have to change the incentives. To change the incentives, you have to know what's really important. One of the principles, I really believe in is you get what you pay for, you get what you incentivize,
Mm.
and the government incentivizes people to make PowerPoint charts that describe whatever the theory of the day is, whatever the strategy of the day is, or whatever the policy of the day is. If you incentivize people to deliver PowerPoint slides, that's what you're going to get.
Welcome to KPI Fireside. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. In every episode, we explore the spark, the moment, the mindset, or the method that ignites real change. Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, you'll find the insights and inspiration to fuel your next improvement. Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. I am your host, Keith Norris. Our guest today is Chris Gunderson. After a 27-year career as a Navy oceanographic officer, Chris, in 2004, was recruited by the Naval Postgraduate School to lead a very unique initiative. His task was to form a government industry collaborative organization modeled after the World Wide Web Consortium. The aim was to co-opt DoD's, Department of Defense, procurement bureaucracy and embrace the rapid cycles of improved capability ubiquitous in the commercial sector. The initiative fizzled, the DoD retained its culture of bureaucracy, but Chris became an expert in the Department of Defense bureaucratic patterns of failure. For the next 2 decades, he was embedded in various DoD weapon system programs to help them adapt effective commercial development practices in spite of themselves. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Keith. Good to be here.
Let's start with the book. The title of your book, the one that you recently put out there on Amazon.
Yeah, you're surprising with that. It's called Founders' Fear. Founders being the founders of the country, the framers of the Constitution. Their fear was that political parties, 2 big political parties would arise, and that the partisanship that would come out of that would interfere with the checks and balances that they had built into the Constitution. Pretty explicitly, Washington and Adams had that fear. And the book's premise was, well, that seems to smell kind of like where we are today. What would happen if that just went a little bit further? And that's kind of where the book goes. But in the background, there's this flavor of government dysfunction leading to potential disastrous outcomes from a broader governance perspective. But the idea that the government, has a lot of dysfunction across the board, including the way it builds its systems, is a running conversation in the background in the book, which would be kind of the connection to this talk today, I guess.
Interesting. So tell us a little bit about your story. I mean, you're now retired, so we've got a lot that I suppose we could get into. Tell us a little bit about your journey. I'm really curious. I like to ask the question about the spark. Like, how did you get involved in this improvement discipline? So tell us how you got to that point.
Yeah. So I was in the Navy. There I was, fat, dumb, and happy, a Navy captain in the oceanography program. I had the coolest title in the world. I was the deputy oceanographer of the Navy. And I had an office. The oceanographer of the Navy actually owns the Naval Observatory, where the vice president's house is. And our office was there, middle of a, incredible museum, if you will, telescopes from Galileo and books from Copernicus. But anyway, my job as the deputy to the admiral, I was a captain, was essentially to get everything done. And everything included buying ships, oceanographic ships for the country, for the Navy, and buying systems like satellite systems and building information systems, sharing all kinds of data, all the data that's collected around the world for weather and oceanography, and building it into information sharing systems. So oddly, I kind of learned how that business worked, all the politics involved, the bureaucracy. And frankly, I got an inkling that it was kind of broken. From that job, I did well enough that they sent me to be in charge of, was a commanding officer of a place called Fleet Numerical Oceanography Center. And the significance is that's a supercomputer center that has a real life mission to do, daily predictions of weather and oceanographic kinds of things. Again, collecting all kinds of data, running a supercomputer, collecting data operationally. So they have to kind of um, change the tires while the car is moving. You have to continuously upgrade supercomputers as you go. You have to keep changing out the equipment. These guys had a shrinking budget and, this mission where they had to get this stuff done. So they figured stuff out, and they'd been doing it for decades. And the people who grew up in that world were really good. They were government people and they really knew what they were doing. They were engineers. They figured out open source. They figured out agile way before it was cool. And so I learned it was possible, that you could really do this. But, I kind of asked them one question from my perspective. They gave me the stats. We do this many weather forecasts a day. We do that many wind forecasts, this many wave forecasts. And I said, yeah, but all of that stuff that you put out of there, how much of it is used? Who uses it? And for what? And I got, shocked silence from that. That's sort of, so you see where this is going, and speed me up if I'm going too slow, but the inkling of, technology without value is worthless, right? And so improvement is, these guys figured out how to do continuously improvement of their technology. Very impressive. Maybe, they weren't doing the best job they could with respect to creating a product that the customer could actually use.
Could you tell us about that Porter's value framework?
Yeah, value chain analysis, the value chain methodology. Porter invented that in the and it's essentially based on another business principle that is first things first and second things never. The only thing that matters is what your customer gets at the back end, and any internal process that doesn't contribute to the delivered product is extraneous. And so you need to have a robust mathematical framework for, first of all, defining the specific increment of value, what the specific customer would value downstream of your manufacturing process and delivery process. It could be a software service delivery process. And upstream, you need to find the correlating activities that lead to the downstream value delivery. So measures of performance upstream and measures of value downstream. You need to connect those mathematically. And if you do that, then you can create a system that will allow you to literally monitor whether or not how you're doing with respect to delivering value and adjust upstream as necessary to achieve the downstream concepts. I believe that's where you and I kind of come together. That's from a big picture.
When you say value chain analysis, would that be similar to like a value stream mapping exercise where you're linking together the value add elements?
Literally. So from a principal perspective, absolutely. I mean, Porter 101, exactly what he said. From there, my job was, how do you take these high level abstractions, good concepts like that, and at the same time, specific techniques, like for instance, Lean Six Sigma, those kinds of agile software development. How do you take the big idea, the specific techniques that exist in the world and can be useful in the world, the facts of life in government acquisition bureaucracy, and adapt the one to the other, amidst a culture of, bureaucratic fear, if you will.
Let me, one thing that I think is interesting, you mentioned, you referred to the definition of value and the customer gets to define the value. I think one thing that is interesting, particularly when people talk about commercial and, let's just say regular business versus government, the perception of value, I think, can be quite different. I'm curious if you might have some insights or if you saw some examples of like a typical business that's in, let's say, trying to make money with a customer versus.
I'm going to say that's a fantastic question. So one of the things you're going to find whenever somebody like me comes along and says, government can learn a lot from industry, how come Google or Apple can do this amazing stuff and the government, it takes forever? They'll say, well, those guys are just trying to make money and the government's got to save everybody's lives and preserve democracy from, evil stuff. And I'll say, you're missing the boat, brother. If money is your measure of value, or if it's your proxy for a measure of value, cool, that's good. That's an easy thing to measure. If customer share is important to you and you can find a way to measure it, that's great. But trust me, money is a proxy for value, and it's exactly the same thing. It may be, in some cases, more difficult to find an objective measure for stuff like, extra second to make a decision, which would be, so if you have, in my initial work, we were doing this network-centric value stuff. And so the value of information is to support a decision if you can make a better decision faster than the other guy. So it's all about, getting the information to the right person a little bit faster, a little bit more accurately, a little bit more concisely. That stuff should sound familiar to you. That's exactly what they do on Wall Street, and they swap that out every quarter, right?
Yeah.
So I say not so much from a principal perspective. If you have somebody who knows what they're doing, you can translate.
Excellent. Yeah, that's interesting. I know sometimes when I have these conversations about value, particularly inside organizations with customers, like the word customer gets used to describe like what's valuable in the eyes of the customer. I think one thing that's kind of interesting to note is that the customer doesn't always have to be the person that's paying you money for this thing. Sometimes the customer could be your boss. It could be somebody else in the organization. It could be a resident of a community in a government type organization or something. You were kind of touching on some interesting views of
Yeah.
who the customer is. Maybe you could give us a couple of examples
Well,
there.
and it's another, easy thing to get distracted about, people will say, well, the customer is the customer, the actual end user, or is the customer the person who's going to process the information on the way to the end customer, or is the customer the sponsor who's paying for all of this stuff? And I'm saying that's just a distraction. At the end of the day, there's a product or a service that needs to get to the end state in your value chain, and you can find that. And whoever that individual or that system is, you can define the thing that it needs. And that's customer value from the perspective of Porter's, theory about value chain management.
Now you mentioned with this initiative that you come back to, you said that you felt not successful in the overhaul of the government bureaucracy. Tell us a little bit more about why you feel that way.
Well, I'm guessing you might ask me, well, what were my big successes in this
That's
world
what
of
I'm
teaching
getting
government to
at.
get out of its own way? And it's very, and I wanted to have sort of an optimistic answer to that question, but I don't really. Frankly, I'm very pessimistic about the lack of, real expertise in the government and a willingness to, you know, do other than, one of the principles, I really believe in is you get what you pay for, you get what you incentivize, and the government incentivizes people to make PowerPoint charts that describe whatever the theory of the day is, whatever the strategy of the day is, or whatever the policy of the day is, and you build PowerPoint slides that pretend like you're actually going to achieve that stuff going forward. If you incentivize people to deliver PowerPoint slides, that's what you're going to get.
Spend time doing that. It almost sounds a little bit like what some people might refer to as like a steering committee or a
Yeah.
council, where you're getting people together, maybe without a whole lot of like formal authority to tell people exactly what to do, but trying to inspire them with some best practices. Was it something like that?
It was actually intended to be more than that. The organization itself was intended to be almost, a combination of a standards body like the ICCC and an industrial consortium like the pharma, where the people who are in the industry literally come together, work together to build out the standards, agree on the standards, and then come together so the customers can purchase the tools and put it all together. So the government was supposed to find a way to get the vendors to come together, in an open forum, develop these standards, and convince the government to lower its bureaucratic barriers and write contracts faster, and get things done more quickly. So it was intended to do that kind of thing. And what the government likes to do is what you said, is to sort of sit back in an ivory tower and create policy documents and write PowerPoint slides and ask industry to come to big meetings and trade shows and present their PowerPoint slides, and we can play this game.
What were some of the best practices of some of the good leaders? What are the things that they did do?
Well, it's interesting, around the time that the Goldwater's Nichols Act was being written in 90, I guess that was 96, I think, somewhere around then, when the latest version of the reorganization of the military came out. About that time, that's when the internet was getting started. And on the one hand, Goldwater Nichols, sort of led eventually to the government outsourcing its brains to the Lockheeds and the in the big companies of the world. There were a lot of people in government engineering who got it, who really understood this new internet was coming and we were going to have many to many networks as opposed to point circuits. And they realized that it was going to be all about modularity and building things on an open standard. They came up with stuff like the Defense Information Infrastructure Common Operating Environment, DICO. You may or may not have known about that. Very early effort for the government to have its own IEEE-like standards for building information systems. Um, it eventually led to a lot of good things, but it also eventually died out because, the structure and the discipline was such that it was hard. You really had to know what you were doing to make that happen. But one tremendously good thing that came out of that effort was something called the Acoustic Rapid COTS Insertion Program. COTS standing for Commercial Off the Shelf, acoustic having to do with using sound to find submarines. And so I think it's an interesting story. The U.S. had a superiority over Russia and China with respect to our ability for our submarines to find their submarines. Big advantage. By the 90s, that advantage had gone away and it was getting worse. And that was very, very frightening. Now, the cost and time it takes to improve stuff like submarines, nuclear submarines, staggeringly expensive and took forever to get that kind of thing done. So there was the fear of God, if you will, we in the United States have to do something to regain our advantage in the submarine world. And so they were, no holds barred, do whatever you need to do. And they came up with this idea that, okay, first of all, we need to have real experts in the government run this thing. And those people are not just admirals and senior engineers, they're chief petty officers who need to go out into the fleet and bring in all of the real experts and get them in a room and have them try out stuff on the one hand. Then on the other hand, this idea of building, very proprietary systems over long periods of time under the intellectual property model owned by a gigantic prime contractor won't work. We really need to open the tent up to commercial off the shelf builders of chipsets and motherboards and components and who write software. So it's a long story and you see where it's going, but they were able to, create they use their big integrator just to pull the pieces together, not to own all of the subcontracting. The government, opened up the bidding to all of the innovative small companies to come in, and they created a sacrosanct, cycle of every year they're going to update the software and every 2 years they're going to upgrade the hardware. We're going to do, you're going to bid by proving that your component plugs in. Validation and verification and, asking for, a bid is the same thing. You're going to bring in your thing and plug it into my system. And if it works better than the other guys, you get the contract. They literally did that. It literally worked. The metrics are you can Google it. Metrics were crazy good, as far as cost and performance. And to this day, that's still the way that the submarine, that was, 98 when they started doing that. And to this day, they're still upgrading submarine internal acoustic stuff the same way. So that was a tremendous success. And anybody, my age who's in acquisition will tell you the same thing. And that was it, from that point forward, it kind of went downhill.
It does sound a lot like what's happening right now with AI everywhere. AI is this latest technology that all the governments feel like they got to get, ahead of because it's this fear that somebody else is going to be so far ahead of them with that. So that's kind of interesting. I want to drill into some of the things that you referred to as the Gunderson's universal lessons about managing programs.
Yeah.
And one of them was 3 points that you said about something that all good chief executives do. What were those things?
Yeah, and let me test me on that. Make sure you agree with me. The first one is you got to find your successor kind of thing, meaning that you need to have good people who have the power to do the thing that they need to do in the right places. Number one. Number two, you need to know what's important to your business model, which means you need to know what value your customers want or you think they're going to need if you're going to try to do some shoot ahead technology. That means you need to have some way to monitor how well you're doing against where you need to get. So you need to have some leading indicators and some lagging indicators. And I'm saying that, when I say, if I said a dashboard, a lot of people would say, oh, well, what brand, or which technology do you use? And I don't mean that. You could do it on yellow stickies, you can do it in your head, but all of them really know what's important. And then the third thing is you don't spend one dime that doesn't do, get you the first thing according to the second thing. And two,
Yeah.
you tell me if I'm wrong. That's the way all good chief executives operate.
Well, I think that's yeah, a lot of truth to that. Along the lines of resource allocation, putting people in the right place, and then having some what you described as dashboards or telemetry of some kind to know if you're making progress on those objectives. I mean, at KPI Fire, of course, we spend a lot of our time having discussions of metrics. Are you working on the right metrics, the wrong metrics? How to there's so many things that you can measure. There's a lot of great quotes about metrics. What gets measured gets managed, and then you said what you pay for gets done. So how do you reconcile this idea of you get what you measure versus you get what you incent and pay for?
Yeah, so and that's the trick. That's what every chief executive does. At the end of the day, you get what you. It's the same thing to say you get what you measure and you get what you pay for. The second part of what every chief executive does about managing stuff, in my opinion, my experience, most generals and admirals are pretty good operationally. They do that. When you see them, capturing a terrorist or winning a battle or something like that. That's how they operate in the operational sense. So how do you reconcile, you get what you measure, you get what you pay for. My experience is, you got to be really, really careful about measuring stuff because it's expensive, difficult. People hate it. It's hard to do, and you're not going to get it right the first time. And you really have to figure that out. But when you do, you know, that's what you have to hold people accountable for, and that requires a certain amount of, I'll call it rigor, engineering rigor. But at the end of the day, that's paperwork. There's a certain amount of paperwork that goes with that. So the balance that you said reconcile it. The balance you're looking for is the absolute minimum amount of bureaucracy or rigor that you need to assure that people are keeping track of the downstream value metric and the upstream leading indicators, and you know exactly where you are. And that's, who do you promote? How do you spend your days? What do you do in your meetings? How do you, bid out your contracts? All of it. If it doesn't come back to that, PowerPoint has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, we have a phrase that's been shared on our podcast before about the mythical PowerPoint dollars that show up only on the PowerPoint but not in other places. This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire. Are you struggling to ignite real change in your continuous improvement program? Firestarter is your field guide. Real stories, proven strategies, no fluff. Get it now on Amazon. Chris, you said that the key to success is to change the culture, but you also said that's a little bit like saying the key to becoming wealthy is just to get a lot of money. So how do you go about identifying what the culture is and actually making changes to affect it?
Yeah. So the difference between culture and behavior is zero. There's no, you can read the definitions and there'll be a subtle difference. But what I care about is what you do. How are you going to react to what I do? And, and I can't tell you how many times, they said, well, really, the problem's just the culture. All it is the culture.
It's too vague. I mean, I love the word
Yeah.
culture. I love the concept of culture, but it's too vague to just say the culture.
Yeah. And so behavior is habits. And if your habit is every time you're going to have a meeting with your boss, there's going to be a row of backbenchers and a row of front benchers, and somebody with the most stars sits at the top, and somebody presents a PowerPoint brief and they talk through, a discussion of what's going to make the general happy. That's really the culture of bureaucracy that people are talking about. Go to any room in the Pentagon, there's either, there could be a captain at the, an Air Force captain at the top, or a major or a colonel or a general or a president. And the room's the same, the long table with guys, people around it who are, important people. And then all of the backbenchers. And then there's this PowerPoint brief, and the weeks and weeks that go into presenting that. That's how decisions are made at every level. I'm going to say that represents a culture. I mean, that's a culture of bureaucracy and hierarchy that people talk about the military having, which is represented by that pattern that you see again and again, which, when I ask the question, well, where is the burn down chart, or where is the, where are we today? Or when you just showed me a bunch of status, but what's the change from the last time we saw this brief? You don't get that. And so the culture of hierarchy and compliance, that leads to that pattern prevents people from, the first question out of the admiral's mouth ought to be, what are the changes? So these were the three issues you gave me last week. What are the three changes, and what are you doing about that? And who have you fired and who have you promoted as a result?
Yeah. That's such a good insight. The language I like to use for these type of interactions is business review. And you touched on something I think is a good insight. It's like being able to see the change. And one thing I've noticed, maybe you could relate to this, is I think sometimes people feel like the senior leaders want this view of everything, like everything's perfect, there aren't any problems, like everything's fine, kind of like this polished PowerPoint, like, hey, everything's good. But I think I don't know if just the vague word of good leaders or interested leaders want to see that delta. They want to see the change. They want to see, like, what are the issues that you dealt with? Because I know that they're there. If they're not on your PowerPoint, you're just hiding them from me.
So, okay, so we're going to divide it into a couple of parts here. One, okay, bad news first is the people who get promoted in the culture, right? And if the culture is the culture I just described, where it's a culture of don't give me the bad news, all I need to do is comply and then I can get promoted, then you're going to get a lot of leaders who don't care about anything else. And you just can't, they may or may not be bad people, but that's what they're used to. They're on the bell curve of,
Hmm.
of goodness, of ability, they're somewhere in the middle, and they're not going to be interested. They don't have time because they're listening to PowerPoint briefings all day long to think deep thoughts about what they ought to be doing. So you can't do anything about those people, right? On the other hand, there are curious, smart people who are in it for the right reasons, who signal versus noise. The noise is all of this, PowerPoint stuff, and they really want people to tell them the truth, but there's nobody out there who's going to do it. And oh, by the way, nobody out there knows the truth, because none of those people are making the measurements and marking the progress that they would need to in order to make the general happy. And neither are their contractors, because they're writing their contracts for compliance sake. So to change the culture, you have to change the behavior. To change the behavior, you have to change the incentives. To change the incentives, you have to know what's really important. To do any of that, you need that first thing that every good leader has, and that's people who get it, who are incentivized to, and are empowered to make mistakes.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. You hear a lot about it's okay to fail, and I think that there's a little bit different intent in there of, like, I don't think anybody truly expects everything to go perfectly all of the time, right? I think that, particularly if you've been around the block a few times, you realize most things take longer than you initially thought. And if you didn't have some failures along the way, you probably aren't making any real progress.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that's on the PowerPoint slide everywhere. Everyone's got that on their PowerPoint slide. To your point, you need to demand competence, and it's not okay just to fail, and you should get yelled at for it, and you need to have stress and everything. But going back to my example about the generals operationally, they thrive on crisis and things going wrong. I can think back to being on a ship and there being a storm and stuff falling over the side, and and the captain's kind of got a little smile on his face, as he's dealing with all this stuff. And it's
Like some people like chaos and strive and kind of thrive in chaos. I think that's
yeah, or they're inherent problem solvers, and they I don't enjoy is probably the wrong word, but they take satisfaction from dealing with it. This is important. This is, yeah.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's actually something that's part of our human DNA, is this idea of we like to solve problems. In fact, I'll tell you a funny little story. I went to the gym the other day with a few of my friends, and I was kind of chuckling. So I've been thinking a lot about AI, and here I am with a few of my friends, and we're in the gym, we're lifting weights, and I'm thinking 100 years ago, we all would have been working on a farm or doing some sort of manual. We wouldn't have need to go to the gym and lift weights. I'm wondering, 20 years from now with AI, are we going to like be going to the thinking gyms with our friends so that we can actually solve problems and use our brains because AI is taking over everything? And kind of made me laugh.
It's that's you have to hold me back. I'll go down that rabbit hole about AI. I've got to, if you, from a technological perspective, AI is my opinion. AI is nothing more than the next generation of Moore's law. There's no big breakthroughs. As processing power increases and memory increases and data volume increases, the computer is able to ask more billion yes no questions. And AI is simply the representation of, well, now, the processors are this many decimal places and the memory is this many decimal places and the metadata is this much more. So the technology of search, which has been around for 30 years, is now faster. And speech recognition, that was going to happen. And there's no fundamental difference to, when Turing back in, the 40s invented digital computers and said, I wonder if someday these machines could think. Answer still is no. That's not
Yeah.
intel anyway.
Yeah, that's good. I'm curious. Being at the tail end of your career, looking back on things, there's often an opportunity to just be reflective. And I'm curious if you were to give yourself career advice earlier on, or somebody who's younger and starting out in their career, what are some of the lessons learned that you might think to pass along?
Huh. Well, that's a great question. And I ask myself that a lot. I think, personally, would I do the same thing again? Did I get enough satisfaction out of going into the military and then, doing what I did there and getting to where I got? The answer is not really. I mean, I didn't have the obvious successes that would have, you know, I am tempted to say, like, I really wish I'd gotten rich. I really wish I was famous. I really wish my book is going to sell 1 million copies, which it's not. And then on the other hand, my advice is to care, and and whatever you do, you owe the people around you. Obviously, you owe them that. I say, obviously, I should be, take as a principle, best effort. You got to give best effort. Otherwise, you're not going to be satisfied, and caring is important, and then more subtly, don't take anything for granted, at face value. Don't believe what you hear from anyone just because they said it, question everything. That's kind of what I learned, and it took me a while to get there, and I absolutely would push that forward, and so you should tell me, "Hey, Chris, on your bucket list was to write a novel. You wrote a novel. Somebody read it. Check. You made it. Anything beyond that's gravy." And that's what I would advise people to try to believe, and to try to keep your ambition in check a little bit.
When it comes to like advice and things that can be useful and constructive out of a conversation like this, I'm tempted to go back to this idea that problems and opportunities are like two sides of the same coin, right? A reason, if you can find the reason why something failed, you can find maybe a reason why something would succeed. When you think about it that way, and you think about some of the things that went wrong, what is your list of behavior patterns or habits that you do recommend for the people that are carrying that torch forward, trying to make government better, trying to make organizations better?
Well, it's kind of goes back to my list of these, the Einstein definition of insanity. They're all very similar ways to look at the same thing, beginning with the end in mind, approaching a problem, first of all, with the expectation that, you need to change your perspective. In fact, that was something that it took me a while to learn. And I remember kind of the day when that happened, when I realized that other people don't see the world the way I see it. So all of this to say is, first of all, recognize that your perspective is, one perspective of many valid perspectives. And no matter how much you think you're right, in fact, in my experience, the more sure I was right and I hadn't missed anything, the more embarrassing it was when I found out that, I kind of missed a big thing. So one of my things was always look for that person, those people who have an opposite perspective, but who you can respect anyway. And no matter how painful it is, make sure they're at the table with you. And so that's really important, and then that's something I don't think we really talked about before. The rest of it is all variations on don't expect that, you're doing it right. If it's a problem, you're not doing it right. And if you don't do something painful to fix it, it isn't going to be fixed. And then, well, you kind of made the point. I thought you said it very clearly is, um, if you know what the problem really is, if you've gotten to the point where you know what's broken, then you know what fixed is. And
Yeah.
from there you can work backward. I always kind of looked at it the other way, as if I knew what it was that I was trying to deliver,
Yeah.
from there I can work backwards, work upstream until I figure out everything I needed to do to get there.
Yeah.
Your point is if you know it's broken, you probably already know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, kind of too, yeah, like, working backwards. If you know what good looks like, then you can tell if what you have isn't good and, work on that forward.
But
That's
if to your point, if that's bad, at
yeah.
least that's a starting point to say, I know it's not that.
Chris, we want to move into a section here called this the rapid fire. This is just kind of short, quick questions, short phrase answer. So the most important job of a leader is to blank.
Most important job of a leader is to make his subordinates understand the most important things and reward accordingly.
Excellent. Do you have a favorite go-to problem-solving tool that you like to use in solving problems?
Do I have a favorite tool for solving problems? Mental tool is I always go to begin with the end in mind, understand the outcome I'm trying to achieve, and work upstream to see what I can do to get there.
I love it. Just habit two. That's being within mind, right? The Stephen Covey habit. I love that one. Do you have a favorite question?
My favorite question is, what are you going to do differently this time?
It's a great one. Great question. What is something that you're most fired up about, something you're excited about right now in life?
Well, for me, that's an easy one. I'm excited about writing my second book.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Is there something that you believe that others around you tend to disbelieve?
Well, is there something that I believe that others don't believe? And it's when I talk about stuff like the ability to overcome government bureaucracy, and all we have to do is, adopt this Einsteinian approach to not being insane. Nobody believes there's a fighting snowball's chance in hell that that's going to happen every time, just like Charlie Brown kicking the football. I think we can do it.
That's awesome. So you haven't given up hope entirely, huh?
I mean, it's not like I don't want to give up hope. I mean, I don't, logically, I think I should give up hope, but I just, for whatever reason, I don't.
Seems like there's another way of doing it. What would you do
Seems
differently
like
this
we ought
time?
to be able to get there from here. Along the line, people do, right?
Do you have a prediction for us about the future of improvement, the future of bureaucracy, or the future of AI?
Is every the spiral of the next generation of technology should be inspiring the teachers to recognize that technology is now further. The tool is more powerful than it used to be. So their students need to be challenged at a greater level. When I started college, I had a slide rule, literally.
Yeah.
The calculator, fancy calculators were there. People were saying, oh man, now students, they're not going to learn anything because they got this calculator. It's so easy. Bull. And then it used to be we plagiarized from encyclopedias, and the teachers said, you shouldn't plagiarize. You can't use cut and pasting out of those encyclopedias. And then we got Google. And the teacher says, oh, now, the students in programmable calculators, and every single time, no, you lazy teachers, you lazy bosses, it's your job to stay on top of that and ask harder questions now. If I were teaching literature, I would demand that my students now, because they got AI, come up with a much more sophisticated product.
Yeah.
That's what technology is all about.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. We really appreciate your time and the experience and the wisdom that you shared with us.
Well, thanks back. You're welcome. Certainly, it's been wonderful experience. That's all I could say.
Yeah, so it's been so great having you here. For our listeners, if you'd like to suggest a guest, ask a question to me or to Chris. Chris, I suppose we can find you on LinkedIn, or do you have a website for your book?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Substack, and if you Google, Gunderson and Founder Sphere, you'll certainly find the book. And, my email address, people in your community who are interested in dealing with the government and understanding the specifics of any of the things that I said or want to dive deeper. I do have an academia website where I've written a lot of stuff about that. And I'm more than happy to talk to anybody anytime. Well,
You can find me, of course, on LinkedIn, also Keith Norris. And this concludes this episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you've enjoyed the episode today, be sure to add a comment, ask us a question. You can give it a follow, a like, a subscribe on the social channel. And please share the podcast with friends or colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change.